Namaste and hello. Welcome to SONAS, South Asia Nadi Sambad. SONAS aims to promote dialogue and sharing of perspectives among sectors, disciplines, geographic regions, and among generations about South Asian water challenges. We believe in wholeness of the hydrological cycle as a foundation to make rivers clean for people and freshwater biodiversity. Every week, we will present our water champions' written perspective and conversation on ideas towards sustainable water solutions. I am your host Ajay Dikshit. You can find us on Twitter at Nadi Sambad. These episodes will also be available in other podcast platforms. Please enjoy the conversation. Welcome and namaskar again. In today's episode, climate scientist Ken McClune of ICET International will talk about the emerging threat of combined temperature and humidity increase in South Asia. Ken is a systems thinker who works across a wide number of sectors and scales of governance to build climate resilience. Ken has worked in South Asia on flood risk reduction and in building urban resilience. Ken, why is increase in temperature and humidity combined should be an issue of serious concern for South Asia?
The body can adjust to heat and humidity over time, and not just the body, but there are also cultural practices that have sort of institutionalized over millennia, right? So you'll see that people will sleep outside at night. They'll visit deep water wells in the summertime where it's cooler in the ground. These sorts of things can help with recovery. But there are many, many more people now than there used to be. So these sorts of watering wells aren't as good for that. You couldn't gather as many people there. And what's happening, particularly with climate change, is that nighttime temperatures are increasing and nighttime humidities are remaining high. So if you look historically at climates, you'd see that during the hottest periods, just prior to the monsoon's arrival, you would get these periods of 2 or 3 days of extreme heat, but then you'd get a little break. And so there'd be 1 or 2 nights where it was cool enough where the body could recover. Now, there weren't scientists out looking at this saying, oh, we should recover these nights. This is just the climatological mean, and people and their institutions adjusted and sort of incorporated that sort of climate in how in their behavior. What we're seeing now in the climate projections is that those periods, those breaks, are going to disappear starting this decade. The projections said about the middle of this decade. And then, with about a 2-week period where there's no break, then extending by the end of this century into a 6-month period without a break. Sort of traditional approach of cooling and using the night to cool off and have the body recover will disappear. And that means this isn't something that we can adapt to.
The body temperature also becomes
elevated, right?
Outside temperature becomes almost similar to your normal body temperature.
That's right. And what happens is that since the body perspires to cool, and if you reach a certain temperature humidity level, the perspiration no longer works. So the body can no longer cool itself. So, we'll hit sort of physiological limits that we just can't get acclimated to. And that will lead to challenges for people, particularly who work outdoors. And to be very sort of narrow-minded about it, if you think about it, just the impact on people who work outside, people who labor outside or spend a great deal of time outdoors will not be able to sort of physiologically recover. So they'll get weaker and weaker as the days go on. So and that's just looking at people. If you look at the environment itself on which we rely, there are also going to be impacts on the environment too. So we need to consider that in considering how do we adapt to these potential change. and it's quite massive.
How would the environment be affected?
Well, like people, the environment also over millennia grew and adapted to the environment, to the climate that was there. And so wildlife, animals will also, livestock as well, will also experience this heat and humidity threshold. They'll have different ones than people do, also be affected by that. So it will either reduce productivity of some of these crops and some of the livestock or some of the wildlife, or it could cause them to disappear, to not be viable in that condition.
So are these heat waves that we see in some of these areas, the Indo-Gangetic Plain, are these heat waves manifestations of that, sort of a potential disaster?
Yeah, as they say, it's always hard to say climate change is the reason for this specific event. But at the same time, that's exactly what it would look like. There's a saying among some people now that they're talking about how this is the hottest August of the last 100 years, or something like that, right? This is the hottest April of the last 100 years. And some people are saying, well, another way to look at that is this is the coolest April of the next 100 years. It's going to look like that. That's what the projections say.
I mean, you did talk about, people outside getting affected, but then if this scenario, if period without any respite, this cooling period not being available, that you said, if that future becomes real, what impact, and we did talk about impact on environment, what specific impact it will have on who would be the most impacted by this,
Well,
by
you
this
could see that
impending
the first
disaster?
people most impacted will be anyone working outdoors. So farmers, people who don't have air conditioning, active cooling of some sort, people who like bikewalas, people who are whose job is to labor outdoors, construction workers, street cleaners, anyone who's outside, who's laboring particularly, will have a particularly hard time in the new conditions. But ultimately, unless there's active cooling involved, it would be anyone who's, particularly many people indoors, where if there's not active cooling, even a fan won't work because it's just pushing hot air around. If it's not an air conditioning, then people are at risk of the heat.
So by active cooling, you mean, something like an air conditioner?
Yeah. No, the impact that would have, I would say, ultimately would be that people will be forced to migrate. They're going to have to figure out, if they can't make a living where they are and they can't survive where they are, they're going to migrate. Now, it's kind of expected, when looking at urbanization in South Asia in particular, that there's an expectation that there are going to be increasing urbanization pressures. They say something like 70% of urban development in South Asia is yet to come. And so there's going to be there's already a fair amount of what they call pull factors, so the factors that make people want to come to cities. And this is going to be what they call a push factor, or something that pushes them out of where they are now. And so climate change could promote that sort of urban migration. It could potentially, I could see in India, you might have quite a bit of internal migration, but I would also assume there's going to be a fair amount of international migration as well.
So what can we do? Of course, this is a scenario, and hopefully this is based on, certain projection about greenhouse gas emissions and so on and so forth. Now,
Right.
Assuming these scenarios would be something that we have to avoid, what is it that we can do today to avoid, this kind of a dystopic scenario?
Yeah, it feels a little dystopic, doesn't it? I would say some of this is what they call already baked in. So we're going to experience some of this already. So one way to adapt to it is prepare for it mentally and physically, I guess, in the sense that you can see this sort of migration potentially happening, or the loss of productivity happening. There are one could come up with a number of policies where you support people to in their livelihoods as they try to adapt to this change. There was also came up with the idea that you could have subsidized movie theaters where you provide entertainment that people want, so they're willing to spend a little bit on it, but it would also provide a cooling center. The real, another purpose of it being providing cooling for people for a couple of hours, which would allow their bodies to adjust and recover some while also being entertained. So you could work with whatever is culturally and appropriate and provide a means to provide cooling centers that also have other purposes that people actually want to participate in. So these sorts of interventions could probably help. I think ultimately the best thing that we will be able to do is reduce our emissions to prevent some of the worst outcomes of that we projected for the end of the century. There are also people talking about geoengineering, but that's a dangerous trail to go down because we have no idea what the impact would be.
When we talk of climate change, we do talk about hurricanes, we talk about typhoons, we talk about extreme weather, we talk about heat waves, we do talk about rise in temperature, snow melt, and so on and so forth. But heat is not something that you kind of read, or that the policymakers or even general public have kind of appreciated that this is going to be a threat to come if this continues. So how do you bridge this kind of a social context of understanding or appreciation of the problem posed by temperature rise and humidity rise?
Well, you just repeat it often. You have interviews like this, you have papers like the ones we've written, and you keep highlighting it. Actually, heat is, when we first published this paper in 2014?
2014, yeah.
And I remember bringing it to some folks in Delhi, and they were like, no. They were just sort of dismissed it. And it's like, well, but the science is right there. But now you see a lot more talk about heat. And so it's gained some traction now, more so now than it had before. And you're getting more, as they call it, high profile, which is, so you get more people in higher positions talking about it, which is great. And that's sort of what we need and where we are. Maybe a little late, but it's better than still not talking about it. But it's improved a lot in the last 6 years. And I think we'll be hearing more about it in the next 6 because we're going to be really seeing those impacts. So adapting to those and thinking about how to adapt to those is probably where the action should be now, like the movie theater idea, or maybe some social schemes that can help people survive the gaps when they can't be as productive.
Somebody still has to go out in the field and do the job, if not for anything else, just to make their own living. Grow food, families, and so on and so forth. Now,
and maybe
there are millions and millions of such families in South Asia, aren't they?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a population in India alone. There's a population that's the size of the United States population that has no access to a real electricity supply. They've got electricity, the one bulb, but they won't be able to run an air conditioner on that. So there are masses of people who are potentially affected by this coming challenge. So figuring out some way to manage not just the adaptation, but the retreat, as they say, or the migration would go a long way. And I think thinking in those sort of adaptation terms would benefit as opposed to, well, right now it's sort of not even being thought about. They just talk about the challenge right now, but the impacts aren't really being thought about as much. Then there's thinking about adaptation in that way would be really beneficial, I think.
But then this adaptation pathway cannot be piecemeal. It can't be something here and there. It has to be much more systemic and transformative, isn't it?
Well, I think one of the adaptations that are really needed at this point is to bring this sort of understanding to folks in the context. So I think you're right. And, you were mentioning that it isn't really talked about very much. And you're right in the sense that I think if you went to the local government, they probably are completely unaware that this thing is coming down the pike. And if you talk to a farmer, they wouldn't know what you're talking about. They probably know about climate change, but they wouldn't know about this heat issue and potentially their impact on their productivity. So I think bringing that sort of knowledge to for lack of a better term, to the ground or to the people who will be affected would benefit them so they can think about what they're experiencing in that context. They're like, oh, this is a hot day and I'm not as productive, and this is supposed to happen more so in the future. And then you can start to build some demand from demand side need for like climate services and social services that can help them adapt to that over time. And then coordinating that, that's a very local level effort. And then you need those scales of governance so you can see what are some of the more strategic level, larger systems adaptations that are needed. You can see that from state or province level or ward level out to the national level, out to an international level. And it's at international scale where it gets particularly challenging because we really don't have really good international organizations that govern at that scale. It's much more about building coalitions and collaborations.
Ken, you are a system thinker. So given your experience in South Asia and other places working on climate over the last several years, you are hopeful for this kind of transformative adaptation?
Hopeful, yeah. I'm a climate scientist, so I'm always hopeful in the sense that I keep doing it, right? Yeah, I mean, what I am hopeful in the sense that people are amazingly nonlinear. It can seem like nothing is happening and there's no change and lots of resistance. And then suddenly, very quickly, boom, we change and reorganize and adjust. And a lot of what are doing now in our planning and preparation and thinking and framing things out have to do with having a model available when people want to change. So that's where I find hope in this work. There's certainly challenges ahead, but I think there are a lot of frameworks out there now offering pathways that people will that provide hopeful pathways for futures when people adjust to it, when they wake up to this new impact.
Thank you, Ken, for highlighting the threat of rising heat in South Asia. Given the current trend in global greenhouse gas emissions, this threat seems real, and there is no silver bullet adaptive way. Avoiding such a future requires vigorous pursuit of global greenhouse gas mitigation efforts, and that we do not sleepwalk towards such a future. In the next episode, Dr. Siraz Wazir of Gorakhpur Environmental Action Group, India, discusses the challenges of changed local ecology of North Ganga Plains and along Nepal-India border.
Whole of our culture, our traditions, our food systems, our livelihoods, especially of the poor people who are below the economic levels, that is more or less dependent on water or water-related services. So looking at the river as one ecology, within this river ecology, what is the livelihood, what is the flood, what is irrigation, what is developmental activity, and so on.
Till then, have a happy week and Jai Hosts.